Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink is by MontBlanc, which is, I know, that's how I say it because that's how I've heard it all my life. I know it's supposed to be MontBlanc, but that sounds like I've got a mouthful of cheese or something. So, anyways, MontBlanc Oyster Grey. Now, when you get it in a bottle, the bottles tend to look like this, except, you know, gray, not green. And when you get them in cartridges, they tend to look like this. Let's see if I can open it this time. Of course it doesn't want to open! Anyways. One of the interesting things about the cartridges, and this has always been the case, I hope this comes through on camera, but yeah, it tends to turn the cartridges pink. I don't know why, but it also turned the inside of one of my JinHao's, Hero 616's pink, so something to be aware of. And I thought I'd compare it to some other grays that I have. Here's MontBlanc Oyster Grey, which you can see like has some purpliness to it. It almost has like this weird gold thing going on. Also, compared to Diatramentus frankincense, which smells like Christmas-scented air freshener. Diamine Graphite Grey, which you can see definitely leans more towards green than purple. And then Noodler's Lexington Grey, which on the smeary thing looked so pale compared to everything. So I decided to write with it in a pen, and it's actually much darker. When you write with it, it's darker than just about any of these. And so then I thought I'd compare the writing. Lexington Grey versus Oyster Grey. So, admittedly, Lexington is probably my favorite gray that I have yet encountered. But Oyster Grey was definitely the first. As I might have mentioned in some previous reviews, I was given cartridges most of my life before I got really into the hobby, lifestyle, whatever. And MontBlanc was usually the ones that I got given. And Oyster Grey was one that I was given a lot of. So all the tests were done in this, come on, JinHao X450. In fact, I think it's still in here. It is! Lovely. Good to know. And this AG Spalding Bros with a medium nib, but it's a very fine medium nib. The nibs, I believe, are made in Japan. And this is a very moderate pen, so it's mid-range in wetness. Now, I did some chromatography, and I did two different ones, and so I'll explain that in a bit. Here you definitely start to see that purple. So there's the gray at the bottom. You still get that weird, almost hint of gold thing going on, and then there's the lavender up the top, and there's little like hints of pinkiness, and for some reason it all gathered there in this one, but yeah, there's little bits of pink. And then for fun, I put a drop and let it dry. So let the ink blob fully dry in the cellulose of this coffee filter, and then dunked it. And as you can see, a lot more remained at the original site. So this would lead me to believe that possibly once it's dry, it's a bit more permanent. Or, you know, like once it's had time to ferment in the paper. Top down in density, Clairefontaine 90 grams per square meter. In the moderate AG Spalding, it took 12 seconds to dry. In the wet JinHao, it took 18. As you can see, there's a good degree of shading. However, I feel like, as you might be able to see in the writing, it kind of just highlights how thin the ink can be in points. But, yeah. So overall, no bleed, no feather, no spread. Very well behaved. I do think it makes it look a bit thin. As I said, I prefer it in wetter and broader nibs because it tends to let it get a bit darker. With a finer writing, you know, like a finer line, the places where it gets light, it can make it a little hard to read. Here, as you can see, a lot of it is gone, but what's there is really dark and really clear, so it's oddly patchy. Yeah, no bleed. Next is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. where it took 13 seconds to dry in the AG Spalding and 20 seconds to dry in the JinHao. And again, you get a decent degree of shading, but again, I feel like it kind of highlights the thin areas of the ink. So in a very fine line, it can be a little difficult to read, but no bleed feather spread. Again, where the ink remained, it's very clear and very dark, but where it's gone, it's pretty gone, so it's pretty patchy. Next is Tomoe River Paper, where the AG Spalding took 14 seconds and the JinHao took 20. But you really see how light this ink can get. It's yeah, it's very thin, it's very light, and here on the thinner writing, it's like if I had to read a whole page of that, that would possibly be a bit tiring on my eyes. It still looks very thin in the broader pen, but since it's wetter and puts down more ink, it tends to pool a bit more and be a bit darker. Again, where there was more ink remained, but it's still pretty patchy. And since it is a fairly light ink, there's not a terrible degree of echo. Next is 20-pound Copier Paper, in which I only use the AG Spalding. It took 4 seconds to dry. And on here, because there was less, pooling, less shading, it got darker, which I feel makes it easier to read, especially if you compare the last two tests. Look how much darker it seems. But yeah, there's some spread, there's some feather, there's some bleed, but really not too bad. It's a bit more bleed than I would like in such a moderate pen, but you know, it could be a heck of a lot worse. Best water test we've seen so far. It's fairly dark, fairly consistent. Next is Mead Notebook Paper, where it took 3 seconds to dry. It's still fairly light. There's almost no feathering. There's the bleeding was really patchy. You know, it was only at the edges, which makes me think it was just a bad pressing process. Because I mean, most of it, you know, look at that. There's nothing. So that was nice. I said it might do even better in a fine or an extra fine. The water test, you know, the more there was, the more that remained. But there's some. It's not too bad. No, it didn't bleed or explode. And last is Moleskin Notebook Paper, and this is the new Moleskin Notebook Paper that for some reason is acting really, really quality. So I was losing my patience because I know for a fact that this is not how this ink will act on this paper most of the time. Moleskin paper is like, someone described it as Russian roulette, and that's really true. Sometimes you get this, where there's no bleed, there's no feather, no spread. And other times you get what we've seen on most tests, which is where it gets annihilated. So, anyways, AG Spalding took 7 seconds, JinHao took 9. It is pretty light, but, you know, that does, you know, some shading. The water test, where there was more ink, more remained. But this is I'd say overall, this is a pretty decent water test compared to the previous ones. So, there you go. For your consideration, MontBlanc Oyster Grey. It's a nice gray. This is my old-timey gray. Like, if I'm ever feeling nostalgic, this is one of those inks that I reach for. However, it's not the most well-behaved. It's a little light. It's not terribly permanent, but it's pretty well-behaved. It might dye components of your pens a weird, like, pink color. But anyways, for your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.